So you can see that Japan's plan, at least in 1942, was working in a large part, right? This is the size of the Japanese empire, right? They have taken over Southeast Asia. They have taken over parts of Southeast Asia, such as Indonesia and Malaysia, that have lots of rubber and oil. French Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos will provide a lot of food for Japan, so much that hundreds of thousands of people there will die of starvation. Japan will, of course, take the colony, or will take the Philippines. We'll talk more about the Philippines shortly. And you can see they will grab a huge amount of strategic territory very quickly. And their goal was basically to make it so hard, to fight so hard to hold that territory, that other countries would just give up, particularly the United States would just give up and say, it's not worth it. Let Japan keep it. That was their hope. So we need to talk briefly about how people reacted to the Japanese. I'm going to give you two contrasting cases. When the Japanese attacked Indonesia, they were celebrated by the Indonesians, right? The Indonesians welcomed the Japanese because the Japanese were driving out the Dutch, who had colonized Indonesia for hundreds of years, and who the Indonesians had not been able to kick out. So the Indonesians were very happy about when the Japanese came initially. And you can see there this image. You have this Japanese kind of propaganda truck with a Japanese sign as well as English and Indonesian signs as a kind of way to help us see this. You can see the women there are looking at that and are going to be listening to the Japanese propaganda favorably because, hey, they liberate us from the Dutch. Now, the problem is this ends up resulting in imperialism just in another name. Japan came into Indonesia and said, we are fighting for Asia for the Asians, right? We're fighting for Asia for the Asians. We want to liberate Asia from European imperialism. The problem was the Japanese brought in their own imperialism. They would take huge amounts of rice from Indonesia to fight the war. They would try and get Indonesian laborers to work for them to prosecute the war. So while they were initially welcomed, later on the Indonesians would not be so happy about them being there, though they were glad that they got rid of the Dutch. While the Indonesians welcomed the Japanese, the Filipinos did not. Filipinos would actually resist violently the attacks by the Japanese. And you can kind of see it here on the left. That's an American propaganda poster, the Fighting Filipinos, holding aloft not an American flag, but a Filipino flag. And on the right, those are Filipino guerrillas who would fight against the Japanese. And you may say, well, wait a second, wasn't the Philippines a colony of the United States, just like Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch, of the Netherlands? Why did the Filipinos resist the Japanese while the Indonesians welcomed them? And the answer is simple. The United States had promised the Filipinos that they would be given independence by 1945. And in fact, Americans had made concrete efforts to help prepare the Philippines for independence. So by this time, the Philippines actually had a functioning government made up mostly of Filipinos, not made up of Americans, but made up of Filipinos. So the Filipinos weren't happy about this because the United States had promised it would leave, and it was really going to leave. Right? It was getting everything ready so we could leave. Whereas the Japanese came in and didn't say anything about leaving. Right? They didn't say anything about leaving. And one thing I've mentioned this before in class, but I'll restate it. That my wife is from the Philippines. One of her father's brothers, so one of her uncles, died because he had the Japanese were so cruel and took away so much rice that the Filipinos were forced to hide in the mountains, where many of them died of starvation. So, and there were just a lot of really bad things done to Filipinos. So they resisted this, often, like I said, violently. Incidentally, my wife's grandfather was actually a guerrilla soldier who fought the Japanese. His contribution was stealing rice that the Japanese had stolen from the Filipinos first. And that may seem kind of quaint, I suppose. But the point is, if he would have gotten caught doing that, the Japanese would have shot him. And what this meant was that the Americans would fight on the side of the Filipinos. Filipinos and Americans would fight together against the Japanese. When they were defeated, the Americans would still try and assist Filipino guerrillas to continue to resist the Japanese. Right? And you can see an image here. This is actually after, once the Americans come back to try and help the Filipinos drive out the the Japanese, you can see an American soldier meeting with Filipino guerrillas. And one thing I want to point out that I think is fascinating, my wife is from southern Leyte. She's a Lateño. She speaks Visayan, not Tagalog, if you're familiar with the Philippines. And a guerrilla fighter from that area is Captain Nieves Fernandez. Nieves Fernandez helped lead a guerrilla unit against the Japanese. And one thing I want to point out, the reason I wanted to mention this person in particular was it's not the man on the left. Captain Nieves Fernandez is the woman on the right. Right, so you had this Filipina woman leading this attack resistance to the Japanese. Now, there's two battles that I expect you to remember that I'm going to talk about, and it's important to know how those battles are different. The first battle is the Battle of Guadalcanal. Right, Guadalcanal is a small island, but a strategically important one near Australia. And this was a very long battle it was basically between American and mostly Americans, but also included like Australians and Brits as well, and also troops from New Zealand. And this was a very long battle. It lasted from August 1942 to February of 1943. So I don't want to make it sound like this was an easy battle. However, the amazing thing about this is that Allied American technology allowed for a tremendous victory. It took 22 Japanese soldiers to kill one Allied or American soldier. In other words, for every one Allied or American soldier that died, 22 Japanese died. And that's pretty astounding. And one thing we also want to stress is that the United States had much, and its allies had many greater resources, especially the United States. The U.S. could replace its losses. And I don't like to talk about human beings in such a callous way, but the key thing is the United States still had a lot of people, whereas Japan didn't. And in fact, most of the army was tied down in China. The United States will actually only fight about 1/6 of Japan's army. 5/6 of Japan's army will be fighting in China. And that makes things a little bit easier. And one thing I want to stress, that this happens at Guadalcanal in this surrounding campaign, a lot of Japanese soldiers just starved to death. Like, they were not given supplies by their government, adequate supplies. So there were a huge number of Japanese soldiers that died of starvation. There's one argument that more Japanese soldiers died of starvation than died from enemy action. So you can see how the Japanese are just already are low in resources, because remember, they've already been fighting for like 4 years. And for a while, the Americans are just able to repeat the success, right? It's not easy, it's difficult, it's expensive in terms of lives and property, but the United States and its allies are relatively easily able to defeat the Japanese because of our advanced technology without tremendous losses on our sides. However, the Japanese military will show that it is willing to adapt. It will show that it has a certain amount of flexibility. And you can see that in the Kamikaze. The Kamikaze, literally this word means divine wind. Kami means spirit or god. And the Japanese emperor was considered a living kami. And kaze means wind. And in the 13th century, when the Mongols tried to invade Japan, their fleet was destroyed twice, actually, by typhoons. And the Japanese said, aha, the gods sent this to protect us because we're the land of the gods, because our emperor is descended from Amaterasu, the sun goddess. So the Kamikaze, though, in World War II are a little bit different. Kamikaze were suicide attacks. A Japanese, and the most popular one, most wide used, was a Japanese person piloting a plane with bombs ideally into an American ship. And you can see an example of that here on the right. There's a Japanese plane about ready to hit the USS Columbia, a ship named after South Carolina's capital. But they also had other kinds of suicide attacks. Sometimes this could just be a person with a bomb charging at American soldiers, but they also had like suicide boats and things like that. But the key one were the planes. Now, first of all, one thing we have to stress is that, or the basic question we have to kind of ask ourselves is, why would people do this? Why would Japanese soldiers be willing to do this? Well, first of all, it was just ideology. Was they were told, in essence, that they owed everything to the emperor, that they owed everything to their country, and therefore it was right and good that they sacrifice themselves for the country. In addition, they were also told that when they died, their spirits would go to Yasukuni Shrine. It's a shrine you can still visit today in Japan. It's where the war dead are enshrined. And Yasukuni Shrine is, in a sense, important in this respect for two reasons. The first is that the emperor will actually bow there, and it's the only place that the emperor would bow. Right? Everywhere else, people have to bow to the emperor, but the emperor doesn't bow back. But in Yasukuni, he will bow to the war dead. But also, when you die and you go to that shrine, your spirit will still act to protect Japan. So it's not like your death is the end. You will live on as a nation-protecting spirit and help guard the nation as one of these spirits. But whether, and some Japanese people believed in it, a few did disagree and did not believe in it, but even if you disagreed with it, there was this understanding that by attacking the Americans in this way, you could maybe stop them from invading the country, and that would protect your community, that would protect your family. And I think it's hard to get people to die for an idea, but it's comparatively easy to get people to die if they believe that their deaths will protect their family, their friends, their community. In addition, there were actual rewards given for people who did this. Their families were given extra rations and things like that. And remember, Japan did not have much food. So you could literally save your family's life in a sense by becoming a kamikaze pilot because they would be rewarded with extra rations. And one thing we have to really stress about this, because from an American perspective, this seems really crazy, but this was effective. This is one of the most effective tactics that the Japanese had. This actually, this was able to inflict huge numbers of casualties on the Americans at relatively light cost to the Japanese. Remember we talked about how that 22-to-1 kill ratio? Remember it took one American to kill 22 Japanese? Well, the kamikaze almost got to a 1-to-1 ratio. It's not quite there. It's still not quite 1-to-1, but it's almost there. And that's enough to just disturb the Americans and think, wow, how can we can defeat these people. We know that, but is it worth the cost? Right? So remember, Japan had this strategy of basically making conquest too hard, of making the casualties so high that the Americans would negotiate. And a lot of Americans are saying, wow, if we try and keep fighting these people, we will win. But what will the cost be? Right? And is that a cost we're willing to pay? And to continue with this theme of the Japanese developing more effective strategies, we need to talk about the Battle of Okinawa. And this is the last major campaign of World War II. So if you look down there, there's an arrow pointing to Okinawa. You can see it's a very, very small island far away from the rest of the main Japanese islands, but that was considered technically Japanese soil. Right? That was technically considered Japanese soil. And as a quick aside, this map is a more recent map. It has North and South Korea on it. They're not, of course, Korea in this time period was a part of the Japanese Empire and was not divided. But that being said, Okinawa is the focus. And Okinawa, as you can see, is a very, very, very small island. But it was technically considered Japanese soil. It's not simply part of the Japanese Empire. It's considered a part of Japan itself. Now, one thing about Japan, and this goes double for this island, is it has very rocky, rugged terrain. Japan is something like 80% islands, and Okinawa also has a lot of islands, a lot of very high hills, very rugged terrain. The Americans will invade in April of 1945, and the battle will end in June. So about 2 months of fighting. There will be 65,000 American casualties. That's dead, wounded, and missing, and 100,000 Japanese casualties. So this is a very bloody battle. A lot of Americans are killed, wounded, and missing, and you can see that the Japanese are doing a pretty good job of killing wounded and wounding Americans. Now, however, one thing that's curious, this is like the first battle where large numbers of Japanese will surrender. About 7,000 Japanese will surrender. And probably one reason they did this is because Germany will actually surrender in May. So remember, this battle goes from April to June. In the middle of the battle, Germany surrenders. And as Japanese soldiers learn of this, that was their last ally. They're like, oh, geez, how can we possibly defeat these Americans? Because now they can concentrate all their force on us. Now, Okinawa, I think, is controversial because it can lead to two interpretations. The first interpretation, which in many ways I think is correct, is that attacking Japan will result in a huge number of casualties. Now think about this. Look at how small that island is. And there's only about 110,000 Japanese soldiers or so on that tiny island, and they inflicted about 65,000 American casualties. Look at how big Japan is, right? I think at this time period, the Japanese army was like 1 million people. So let's say that, as you can see this, there's like a 2-to-1 ratio. We'll say, for every 2 Japanese casualties, there's 1 American casualty. Well, if the Japanese have 1 million soldiers, then theoretically they could inflict something like 500,000 American casualties. That's a lot of dead and wounded Americans, right? So one interpretation is, wow, attacking Japan will result in a huge number of casualties. I think that is correct. Attacking Japan would lead to a large number of casualties, especially American casualties, right? And during a war, you're not concerned about enemy casualties. You're concerned with your casualties. And people who tend to be pro-atomic bomb tend to emphasize that a large number of Americans would have been killed, wounded, or missing. However, other people who are anti-bomb tend to emphasize the fact that 7,000 Japanese people surrendered. So an American invasion of Japan might have precipitated a collapse of the Japanese society and the Japanese may have simply surrendered and refused to fight, even though their government told them keep fighting. Japanese people may have said, we're sick of this. There's no way we can win. We're going to give up. In the end, we don't know what would have happened because, of course, the invasion of Japan did not happen, right? But this is a basic kind of underlying historical issue related to the use of the atomic bombs. Now, those were what-if questions. What I can tell you, being a historian who studies what actually did happen instead of what-ifs, the Americans were dealt with this basic issue. How do we end a war with a minimum loss of lives against an enemy that does not appear to be willing to negotiate? One thing I have to stress, anytime the Americans did try and negotiate with Japan, they took it as a sign of weakness and said, oh, the Americans are asking for negotiations. It means the Americans are getting weak. We better hold out. So that's the American quandary. Anytime we try and negotiate with the Japanese government, they just become more stubborn. So how do we end this war, right, while minimizing the loss of American lives? And the answer is simple. Technology, right? The answer is simple. The answer is technology. And key to this technological effort by the Americans to try to end this war while maintaining a minimum loss of American life is the use of B-29 bombers. And those are examples of the B-29 flying next to the iconic Mount Fuji. Right, so those are B-29s preparing to drop bombs or having just dropped bombs on Japan. And as I said, one thing I want to emphasize, this is just flat out the best bomber that was developed during World War II. It's an amazing kind of technology. Now, one thing that the Japanese did in order to try and avoid the destruction of the bombers, such as the B-29, was they would disperse their factories. Now, what do I mean by that? Right, so if you have a huge factory, it's relatively easy to blow it up because it's a big factory. It's all concentrated in one space. So one thing that the Japanese did was they would split up factories. So instead of having one big, easily visible from the sky factory, they would disperse production. They would put machines in people's houses, for example, and you would basically work from home. Or they would just scatter the factories all around the city. So instead of having a big factory that you would hit, you would have small factories, or like I said, you'd even have machines in individual houses. And the problem is, even though the Americans typically only wanted to hit military targets or industrial targets, once you start dispersing factories among civilian targets, that highly increases the amount of civilians you're going to kill, right? I mean, if you bomb a factory, you might kill the civilians that are in that factory. But if you have a factory that's very small amidst a bunch of houses, you're much more likely to also hit those houses and kill those civilians. So one reaction that the Americans had to this was the development of an early form of napalm, which are basically fire bombs. And napalm doesn't explode like you might think a bomb would explode. Instead, what it does is it throws out all this jelly. It's like Vaseline. This jellied substance. But unlike Vaseline, this jellied substance bursts into flame when it comes in contact with oxygen. So it when the bomb hits, it's not a huge explosion. There's a little explosion that drives all this Vaseline-like jelly all around, and it gets on buildings and on the ground and on trees. And as soon as it hits oxygen, it catches on fire, and then it catches those buildings, trees, and other things on fire. And it creates these huge fires then. So it doesn't work by like exploding things. It works by burning things down. And the idea is it wants to create a huge fire. So you don't actually have to be accurate with these things, right? You just have to start fires and they'll burn down the whole area and destroy the factories as well as civilian homes. And by the way, if you get this stuff on you, it's very hard to get off, right? Like imagine getting, Vaseline, right? You can't, if you put some on, it's not like you can just take it right off, right? It's going to be there. Now imagine having that Vaseline on you and it's on fire and you're trying to get it off and you can't. You're going to get burnt really badly. You may even die. And the Americans will start using this kind of firebombing against the Japanese cities. And to give you an example, in one night, in one of the earliest firebomb raids, this is Tokyo. That's what this picture is. On the left, you can see Tokyo before the firebomb raid. On the right, you can see Tokyo after the firebomb raid. You'll notice that there's A, a lot of smoke, and B, there's not a lot of buildings. You can see the whole huge areas have been burned down by these firebombs, and it's thought that about 100,000 civilians died in this one night. And that's the most of any bombing run. That's actually more than the number of people killed during the atomic bombings. And to give you another view of what the firebombing would look like, that map can be kind of hard to read. You can see there that it caused huge amounts of devastation. There are some stone and brick buildings that are still standing, but the vast majority of the buildings have been burnt down. And this is an image, a very sad image. Those are some civilians, including a small child, who were burned to death in the fires. And this is disturbing. One thing that's also, in a sense, disturbing is that the Japanese leaders who are living in Tokyo, while this is going on, still refuse to surrender. Right? They're not able to prevent their capital from having large chunks of it burnt down and 100,000 of their people dying in one night. They're not able to prevent that, and yet they still refuse to surrender. Right? They still refuse to surrender. This will lead the United States to then drop atomic bombs on Japan on August 6th and 9th in a kind of a final technological attempt to end the war while minimizing American casualties. One thing that I want to point out that there's a kind of confusion is that people look back in this and say, well, this would have saved American and Japanese lives, and perhaps it would. But as a historian, I can tell you that the American forces were not too concerned with saving Japanese lives. The focus was on preventing American casualties, which makes sense. This is a war after all. But one thing I want to point out, the second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, a city I visited. And what's interesting, a lot of people don't know this, was that the largest Catholic cathedral in East Asia could actually be found in Nagasaki. And there is the cathedral on the left before the atomic bomb hit. The atomic bomb actually hit almost right above this Catholic cathedral, and you can see it there on the right. Right. So I think that's kind of just to give you kind of a close-up view of the devastation wrought by the bomb. And like I say, it's this very interesting thing that of all places is where the bomb went off. This kind of Western religion, in a sense, that had become Japanese is then suffers a huge attack from a Western-delivered bomb. And one thing I want to point out in terms of the way atomic bombs work, and the failure to understand how atomic bombs work, I think, is problematic, and it leads to kind of making fun of people from the 1950s and leads to a misunderstanding of the horror of atomic weapons that I need to address. So you may have heard of duck and cover, and duck and cover is this kind of, if you go to YouTube and look it up, it's about it's a cartoon and a live action film in which a turtle teaches children that in the event of an atomic blast, they should duck under their desks if they're at school, or otherwise try and find cover. And there's actually a part of the film where they say, if you don't have a desk, if you're outside, cover yourself with anything, even an old newspaper. And it's very common for people to look back and say, oh, ho, ho, that's so silly. Those people in the 1950s were so dumb and so scared of atomic weapons and blah, 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 blah. Aren't we smart and superior compared to them? And this is highly problematic based on what happened in Japan. Now, it is true, and a lot of the jokes are based around the idea you can't survive a nuclear blast. It's true. If you're right under the bomb, you are dead. You're going to be vaporized. However, the atomic bomb kills people in a lot of different ways. As you can see from the caption here, from the Duck and Cover comic, it says, so like Bert, you duck to avoid the things flying through the air. When the atomic bomb hits, it creates a huge wave of force of wind that can go, I believe, hundreds of miles per hour and can do things like drive glass into people's bodies and kill them. So ducking down to avoid being hit by flying debris is a great idea. And a lot of people were killed by the atomic bombs because the buildings collapsed on top of them. Well, wouldn't you much rather have a building collapse and hit your desk that you're hiding under rather than collapse and hit your head, right? So one thing I do want to point out within the context of understanding atomic weapons is that, of course, if you're underneath them, no, you're doomed. There's nothing you can do. However, if you're far enough away, you could take action that might reduce the amount of damage you would suffer, such as ducking and covering, right? If you're far enough away, that could protect you from serious injury or at least reduce that injury. And to kind of give you a concrete example of what I mean, I had mentioned that the nuclear blast creates a blast of wind that's very forceful. It also creates a light and heat, right? It creates light and heat. And what happened is Japanese people, when the bombs went off, would see a flash of light. And so your instinct when you see a flash of light is to turn towards it to see what it is. So the problem was people saw the darn flash of light, turned towards it, and then they got hit by that heat and were burned terribly by that heat. And it produced these really weird burns. And this again shows you this kind of what I mean about duck and cover. If you look at this woman closely, she has really weird burns, doesn't she? Right? Part of her body has no burns, right? Doesn't even look like she has a sunburn. Her skin is just evenly colored throughout. But you'll also notice that there are these very strange burns in this kind of pattern. So think to yourself, what maybe caused those strange burns? I can tell you what caused those strange burns. It was her dress. She was wearing a dress that likely had black stripes surrounding white fields, right? So that where the area is black, that's where she had a dark or black color that absorbed the heat. And then the areas that are light, that's where she had the lighter color material and it reflected the heat. And then the areas that are not burnt are the areas that were not turned towards the heat. She was facing away from the bomb with her right shoulder towards the bomb. And that's what created this very strange burn pattern, right? And this is why they encourage you, even if you have a newspaper, cover yourself with a newspaper, because that might shield you just a few degrees of heat, and that would be enough to help you. But my key point here is basically I'm just trying to show you how terrible this new weapon was. And that's why we're so concerned about countries obtaining that weapon that are like rogue states like North Korea. We're scared, what might they do with this weapon, right? It's not just a big explosion that kills a few people around it. It causes huge amounts of damage. And of course, this woman would have received a lot of radiation and maybe would have died later of radiation poisoning. There were people who got sick and died from radiation poisoning just by walking through Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but who weren't there when the bombs dropped, right? So that's my first point, is I just want to emphasize this bomb kills in lots of different terrible ways. And you can defend yourself from the bomb, and it doesn't make sense to make fun of people in the past who actually understood what the bomb could do and then tried to explain it in an effort to try and protect American school children, right? So I want to kind of highlight that. Sorry, that's kind of my pet peeve, but it's also important to understand today why nuclear bombs are so bad and why it's important to avoid them. And, God forbid we should ever have a nuclear weapon detonated again in this world. In any case, Russia will declare war in August 8th. So you have this kind of triple punch. August 6th, the United States drops a bomb on Hiroshima. August 8th, Russia will declare war on Japan. The Soviet Union declares war on Japan. And August 9th, the United States will drop a bomb on Nagasaki. It's arguable, and I think it's somewhat persuasive, that the reason we dropped that bomb was on Nagasaki so quickly after the one on Hiroshima was because we wanted to end the war before Russia was able to expand much and seize too much Japanese territory. So you can almost see how the Cold War is already starting, right? The United States is taking certain actions against Japan, not so much because of the Japanese, but in order to prevent Russia from getting too strong, right? So the Cold War is already kind of warming up. Now, like I said before, I do not think that the use of the atomic weapons or firebombing is morally acceptable. I would argue against that because of the huge numbers of civilians it would kill. But I can also understand Americans and others who make the argument that it is acceptable to use those weapons, even if I disagree with it, because even at this point, there were still disagreements within the Japanese government about whether to surrender or not. Even after being hit by 2 atomic bombs, firebombing, and the Soviet entry into the war. And the key question was the argument about preserving the emperor. You may remember in section 7, we talked about how the emperor was such a key figure in Japanese life. For Japanese people, he represented, or he actually, I should say, he was the nation. So in a sense, if something happens to the imperial institution, that link to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, and ancient Japanese identity, then Japan will cease to exist. So with that argument, many Japanese people didn't want to give up because they were afraid that something would happen to the emperor. But the Americans finally did give a weak promise that we would not do anything to the imperial institution, and we kept that promise. And so what would happen is then the emperor would step in and break the tie. And one thing I should point out is the emperor was not so much worried about, it would seem, sparing the suffering of his population. He was afraid if the war continued, there would be a rebellion against him. But that being said, Japan will, with the emperor breaking the tie, will finally surrender. And that will, in a sense, end World War II. So this brings some of the moral problems facing the Allies. I know that this is a history class, not a philosophy class, so we can't spend too much time on this, but I do want to invite you to think about these issues. And I've given my own personal opinion in this class. I don't, if you think differently, that's fine. This, like I said, this isn't a philosophy class. And even if it was, you don't penalize students just because they think differently. But I do want to raise these moral questions just to think about because of the subject matter. So here's the moral problem facing the Allies. The Axis powers, Germany, Japan, and Italy, are so bad they cannot be allowed to continue to exist. They're expansionist. They're taking over more and more territory. And we've seen already the terrible things they're doing within their territory. The Allies, though, think that they need to be destroyed. Their regimes need to be destroyed. But we also want to win the war with a minimum number of Allied casualties. Soldiers want to live. You want your dad to come home. You want your brother to come home. You want your husband to come home. So in order to win the war while preventing too many Allied casualties, we will use tactics that kill large numbers of innocent civilians, such as strategic bombing, firebombing, and atomic weapons. And I have to stress that we had historically criticized the Japanese and the Germans and the Italians when they took actions that killed large numbers of innocent civilians, including bombing, right? So there's a kind of a problem here, right? We use the same tactics we criticized. And in a sense, this challenges the liberal democratic commitment to equality. Aren't we supposed to be willing, if we think all human beings are equal, to give enemy civilians the same kinds of protections we would expect of our civilians, right? And so this is a difficult moral conundrum. And I want to stress, this is why, I can disagree with people on this issue and still, respect their position, because this is not an easy answer, right? There's no easy answer to this. But it's my hope that studying World War II, and one reason I spend so much time on World War II, is that it will encourage you to think about this, because in the future, you may be the one making these decisions, right? And it's important, and it will be helpful that you have the chance to reflect on them beforehand. Now, in this class, I'm not huge on numbers in terms of remembering numbers, but I do expect you to remember the relative magnitude. So if you look at the human cost of this war, it just dwarfs World War I, right? The Soviet Union and China will each lose about 20 million people. Remember, in World War I, in total, civilian and military, there were about 15 million casualties for all sides. but the Soviet Union will lose 20 million people and China will lose 20 million people. And as we go into Section 11 on the Cold War, one reason why the Soviet Union will expand, will start like kind of taking over other countries, is because of its security concerns. It doesn't want to be attacked and lose another 20 million people. 2/3 of European Jews are killed. There were about 9 million or so Jews in Europe. 6 to 7 million will be killed. Other groups will be targeted for extermination and genocide. You will see the rise, in a sense, of enslavement, of forced labor. Many people will be forced to work for the various regimes. So, for example, this can take a very kind of cruel aspect. Dutch, Korean, Taiwanese, and Filipino women were often forced to be so-called comfort women by the Japanese military. I don't know exactly how to describe them. They were women who were forced to have sex with Japanese soldiers close to the front line. So they were forced to do this. They did not volunteer or choose to do this. And it's not right to call them prostitutes because they weren't paid. They're sometimes referred to as sex slaves. That term bothers me for some reason. But just to understand what happened, these women were forced to be close to the war zone and to have sex with Japanese soldiers. So you had this kind of enslavement, and this wasn't just in terms of, physical labor in terms of building things, but also in a sense, I guess you could say sexual labor. And it's very disturbing, and I don't even know quite how to explain it other than just what I already said. The total dead, including Asia, so including the Soviet and China losses, were about 75 million people. But again, we also have to ask about the moral costs, right? This, in a sense, really kind of stained the hopes that the revolutions we've been talking about raised, right? The political, economic, industrial, and scientific revolutions we've been talking about, the people who helped carry them out hoped that they would help make this world a better place. And in many ways they did. But they also made possible wars like this that could kill so many people, right? So again, this is this kind of difficult heritage that we have to kind of think about in hopes that we can learn some lessons from this. My point of this, I have to stress, and that's why I had that big long thing about Memorial Day at the beginning of this section, is not to just say, let's criticize American soldiers or anything like that. That's not my point. My point is we have to understand how these wars come to be, why they're fought the way they are, so we can hopefully prevent such deaths and such suffering in the future, right? In a sense, that's what a lot of history is meant to do, to help us avoid the problems that we've seen in the past, to learn lessons from suffering, not simply to talk about suffering to talk about it, but to learn something from it.